this is what I think from listening to you, we're in a must-lose situation now, because with the Strait of Hormuz, we can't get it fully open, and we can't get the terms that we want, and Lebanon's not going to go anywhere, or Hezbollah's not going to go anywhere. Now then, the only thing Trump can do is to go back to war, because if he just walks away now without the Strait of Hormuz or without Lebanon, then he is seen as a loser. So it seems to me like almost all the pressure is that he must go and do this, which will guarantee a physical defeat.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think, again, I don't want to keep repeating it, but I think it's true. It's war to the last missile. And we're not leaving until we think we have expended all of our munitions and capabilities. We're not going anywhere. And Donald Trump, the big disappointment with Donald Trump is as follows. If you go back, and it's not just a question of saying before he was elected, but let's look at what he's done since he arrived. What has he really succeeded in fundamentally changing? And I think the answer is nothing. Arguably, one of the keystones in the edifice of success that he was trying to build was the simple passage of legislation on voter integrity. I mean, it's hard to imagine any country in the world that would say, we don't want every citizen that comes to vote on election day to show their identity, lest we should discover they are American citizens. Instead, we don't want to demand anything of anybody. And effectively, we're leaving that into the laps of the states. So there's no voter integrity. If there's no voter integrity, how meaningful are elections? If elections aren't meaningful, what does that say about the republic? Now, you would think that what I just described would be at the top of Donald Trump's list of critical tasks to be performed. Have you heard him say a lot about that lately? Not really. I think he's walked away from these things that were vitally important to the survival of our republic, and instead is focused on all the things that are important to his donors, to the donor class, the globalists that currently govern the West. What else do you want to call them besides donors and globalists? Zionists, neocons, the Epstein class. I mean, use whatever you want, all lump them together. They're the people that are driving this train. They could care less about elections. They could care less about the electorate. They don't care who shows up or doesn't show up. They're in control. That's the problem. And President Trump has done nothing to change that, nor do I expect that he will in the near future.
Yeah, and that leaves us in a big conundrum. I mean, if we just ended the show right there, it's a pretty bleak outlook here. Unfortunately, there's another side to this whole problem here. And you mentioned war to the last missile. Well, that doesn't just apply in the Middle East. That also applies in the Russia-Ukraine war. And in fact, that seems to be something that Volodymyr Zelensky wants to help accelerate, because he's really keenly interested in those missiles.
Недостатньо засобів захисту. Особливо це стосується ракет для Петріотів. Ми усім партнерам довели і потребу, і головне, можливість, як можна дати більше захисту життя. Це просто нонсенс, що в сучасному світі виробництво ще не налагоджено, настільки не налагоджено, наскільки реально треба, щоб був захист людей від балістичного терору. Ми давно зверталися і довели, що можемо виробляти, зокрема, і таку номенклатуру захисної зброї, якби Україна отримала від Америки ліцензії на виробництво Петріотів, нашого виробництва вистачало би і на захист України, і на допомогу партнерам, які цього.
So he's saying, and he has said in the previous few days, look, to all of NATO, forget about this 2027, because apparently there's already some contracts to give them some Patriots in 2027 that have yet to be built. He said, you know what, forget about all that. Give me all of them that you have right now, and then give me this additional ability to manufacture going forward in my country here. What do you think of that idea?
Well, he's also mentioning something else that I think is working. In the context of what he was discussing, he was saying, what is wrong that the Western world is not adequately mobilized, its industry, its capabilities, its forces to support me, Zelensky. Now, you know, I've never been a supporter of this man. He, like everything else associated with the Ukrainian war, is a fraud. I mean, this is someone, Kolomoisky, a famous Jewish oligarch from Russia who then moved into Ukraine and established himself and made billions. He's now, I guess, sitting in jail somewhere. He's the one that found Zelensky, who grew up speaking only Russian, who was a comedian, not a Ukrainian ethnically, and certainly not by birth, and puts him in charge of Ukraine with the help, of course, of the Newlands and Kagans and others. Now, these people created this fictitious government, and we have been backing it to the hilt, thanks to the CIA and the United Kingdom's MI6. And he's saying, look, you put me here. I was willing to try and get out of this with a peace agreement. You sent in Boris Yeltsin. He promised me the world. You haven't delivered. And what he's really saying is, if you don't give me everything now, I'm not going to be here in another year. And he's correct. He is absolutely correct. Now, there's something else that is never mentioned. That is that President Putin has exercised enormous restraint. He's always been opposed to any action that might result in the sudden introduction of NATO forces into the equation. He doesn't want a major war. He's handled that very well. But things are getting rough right now in this war, in the sense that the Russian people certainly have run out of patience. But we need to remember that President Putin also has enormous influence in Venezuela, in Cuba, even in Mexico. He has enormous amount of influence in many countries. He could escalate the conflict that we've got going right now in Ukraine against him, and for that matter, what we're doing in the Middle East to destroy Iran, and move this horizontally into the Western Hemisphere. We are lucky that we've got President Putin on the other side of this equation. The problem is, somewhere along the line, President Trump seemed to promise some degree of flexibility, understanding, or agreement in Alaska. That turned out to be a complete and utter fraud. And I think that's begun to really change the situation and the attitude in Moscow towards us. It's not simply we can't believe in anything the Americans say. They're really the enemy too, just as much as the people in Europe. I think that's very dangerous, and that's why it is not impossible that we could see dramatic events over the next several months. The assumption that the Russians will sit quietly, gradually bite off pieces of their enemy. Now we've got these fortress cities that are falling, but not move beyond that, I think is a mistake. I think it's very dangerous. This is a more dangerous period right now than perhaps any that we've seen to this point. So I don't know which particular conflict blows up in our faces first, whether it's Iran or Ukraine, and I don't exclude trouble in the Caribbean with Cuba and Venezuela and Mexico.